Hello everyone, welcome to the first video on this brand new channel that I'm calling Rat with Paint. That's still being workshopped, but welcome anyway. Today, we're painting an older Games Workshop model from the Lord of the Rings range. This is Lurtz, the Uruk-hai leader from the first movie in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This model is obviously a bit older and made completely out of pewter, but let's see what we can do anyway. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy this painting video. So I start this model with prepping the base first. I add some basing material and then glue on a little resin rock to add some life. Once the basing is done, it's time for a quick coat with the spray primer. With metal models, it's really important to make sure that primer coat is nice and thorough because the acrylic paints like to chip off the bare metal without that primer. So if you miss some of the little cracks and crevices, you might start to see some of that pewter shining through, especially if you're playing with the model like this one's going to be. Make sure that primer coat's nice and thorough. All right, so we're going to start off painting some of the base coats here. You can see there I'm using Curious Leather from Duncan Road's Two Thin Coats and some burgundy hilt. This is going to be the skin tone. So with the Uruk-hai, they have that classic like red brown skin tone. I haven't found a great way to do that with a single paint. So my recipe right now is doing a base coat with this burgundy. It doesn't have to be this color burgundy, but a nice dark red. And then you take that brown and kind of glaze it over the top. And that gives you that nice brownish red coat, especially if you leave some of that red shining through, kind of like patchy. It kind of looks like some blemishes, or it adds some depth to that skin tone that you wouldn't get just with the brown or just with the red. You'll see here, I make sure to get those arms, legs, and his head nice and colored in. Those are going to be the most color on the model. So those are going to be like the focal points. You definitely want to get those nice and covered with the base coat. So here you see I go in with that brown color. It's a little thinner than the red was, but even then it's still pretty thick. I'm trying to get those base coats down over that black primer, but you'll see as I kind of make some progress here, that red still does come through, especially in the shadows, which is kind of neat. It's a good effect. And then like I said, this isn't an exact science, so kind of going back and forth with the brown and red to get that skin tone to a point where you like it. That's what I do, at least. I'm sure I could be more effective with it, maybe glazing over that brown over the red instead of kind of like intermixing them, but hey, if it works, it works, right? All right, so next I'm gonna come in here with barred skin, and this is just gonna be a highlight color. So this is gonna be the first highlight. I'm basically going to be highlighting up the skin tone up into like almost like a pink or a khaki. And you kind of start with the raised edges here. So what I do is I do the nose, I do the brow ridge, and I kind of focus on the forehead because that's where I want the light source to be coming from. My light source is basically like right above him. You can see I kind of come down over the mouth too and kind of like frame the face a little bit with that color. And you'll see it kind of looks a little blocky here, but it will get to a point where it's not as blocky. You come back in and feather it later. So again, we're kind of just blocking in colors and getting the values kind of set up before we blend it all together and make it look good. You might see me put some of this paint on my thumb, and you might think, why am I painting my thumb? That's obviously not the model. I think in my mind, it's helping me thin down the paint a little bit and kind of get it to the right consistency. When you're painting over, like the consistency I'm trying to get with the paint is basically I want it to flow over my skin, but not completely fill in like the little cracks on my skin. So once it's to that level, I know it's about right. So then I'm going to come in with this elven skin. Like I said, I'm trying to work my way up to like this tan color. With the brown skin, like a regular kind of like pale skin tone is a good highlight color. So what I do is I come in here with the elven skin from the Two Thin Coats range, and I kind of just go back over those highlight areas because now I'm going for just the very edges of the highlights and kind of like the very center of that forehead, and that's kind of a good way to feather out some of those highlights. So his face is going to look really ashy here, but then when I come in with the shadow layer here in a second and the glazing of the shadows in, once I come in and glaze the shadows in, it's going to look much better. So you got to trust the process here a little bit, but yeah, this is the highest highlight color I'm going to use for his skin tone. And then here you can see I'm coming back in with that darker brown, that Curious Leather, and adding some contrast in those shadows. So I'm going back into the shadow areas, the eyes, under the cheekbones, kind of around the forehead too, to really outline those highlights and make them really obvious. That contrast is kind of what adds the drama and the depth to your paint job. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. This brown paint is really thin when I'm doing this, and it's just to kind of glaze into those shadows. It's to really bring those shadows a little darker. You can do this with just a black, but I find doing it with the darker color adds more life into the model. Just a black and a white for like shadows and highlights really seems to dull up your colors, and I think a little bit more drama is better. All right, and then I come in here with Ivory Tusk. So I'm going with an off-white because pure white doesn't give as much flavor, I guess, for lack of a better term. I always like doing eyes in an Ivory Tusk. Now, I think Lurtz's eyes in the movie are kind of like this orange, like putrid color. I didn't do that. I'm just going with white. I think the putrid color and the orange is kind of around his irises, and I'm not good enough to paint irises, especially on a metal model. And when you ask me, how do you paint eyeballs? Very carefully is going to be my answer to that. You might have to go in and make some touch-ups with the eyeballs. I think I did here a couple times. So I go in and I do that Ivory Tusk on those eyeballs, and then I also do it on the teeth there, you can see, and that's just like a really light kind of like, you barely touch the side of the brush of those teeth with that paint, and it's on there. And then here I go, I'm going back in with brown paint again, kind of like accentuate those eyelids and really make those eyes pop. So it's the really light color on the dark background that really makes those show on a face. If you're looking at your face, you're gonna notice that your eyeballs are not just like flat. And then here's my most favorite part, and by most favorite I mean least favorite part, the pupils on the eyes. Very carefully is all I can say. There's not really a great way to do this. You can see here I had to go back in with the white, kind of touch up some of them. So I got that left one to a point where I liked it, and I didn't like the left eye. I like the right eye a little bit better, so I wanted to bring that left eye kind of the same level, and then you just kind of go back in and try it again. So that's all I can say is those eyeballs are probably going to take you a couple tries. All right, so there's the eyeballs, and that's the face. It's a little pale, but that's okay. So I'm going to come back in with that brown, and again, I glaze it down. So you can see here, it's pretty watered down. It's very thin, and basically just go in and like kind of pull those highlights back a little bit. So you go to the edge of the highlights and where the other colors are, and you kind of like, with the glaze, it pulls back those highlights, but it still keeps the blend of the colors together, I guess. So you see here, I kind of pull it all down. I pull that shadow back towards his forehead, and like the highlights are still there, and it makes this nice gradient, but it's not chunky colors. There's no like hard lines. That's the goal, is you don't want any of those hard lines. So that's why I glaze down that paint so much. And this is coming back in with the red. Same deal. Same way I did the skin tone. Kind of glaze in the red and the brown together to get that reddish brown skin tone that the orcs have. All right. So now we're going to that white hand of Saruman that Lurtz has on his forehead coming down to his face. So, you know, you're probably thinking like, well, we just spent so much time on his forehead and his face. Why are we gonna do this? Well, you know, sometimes you paint things to a level and then you go, well, gonna have to cover him up. So that's what we're doing here. This is kind of like a freehand thing. It's really small on his face, so that's the struggle here, is getting the freehand to look good at that size. Yeah, you just do your best. I use really thin paint, thin it down with some water, and just like water in the brush, kind of get it to a consistency that you want, and then you just kind of go through and do it. I was matching a picture from the movie to get this to kind of like look right, and that's how I did this. But freehanding on stuff like this, you're gonna have to make a couple tries most likely. It's not always gonna be perfect, but you can see as I kind of keep going here, it adds together, and eventually it looks good, and you're not as sad about ruining your hard work forehead paint job. So all right, so now we're moving on to some base coats on the clothes. The reason I started with the skin is because it's the furthest down in the model. So the skin is the farthest back. So if I need to go back in and fix the skin, and if I start on the outer cloaks, I'm probably going to get paint all over the outer cloaks and stuff while I'm painting the skin. So that's why I start with the lowest point in on the model. And you can see here, I'm going in with this like lighter beige brown, and I'm kind of doing some of his accents here. Lurtz in the movie has like a very dark brown, almost black tunic armor kind of combo. So I'm going into some of the lighter areas on his outfit and adding in some brown, and then I highlight back up with that same kind of skin tone thing. I just don't add the red. So it's kind of that tan color that I use plus the beige brown, and that's what I'm doing his sleeves and his belt with. And I think I go back in later and do his sheath the same way and whatever, but I'm not yet touching his main thing. So here I start to pull out the grays. So like I said, he wears mainly black uniform or black armor or black clothes. So how you show that on a model, and the reason I painted this guy primed in black, is because the gray, it reads black more than just pure black. So if you look at a real life object, you know, clothing that's black, it reads black to you. But if you look at where the sun's hitting it or light's hitting it, it reads more gray to even sometimes a white, or it takes on some of that color from surroundings. So that's how I add highlights here to the black. I'm adding a bunch of gray, and realistically there's probably gonna be more gray on the model at the end of the day. But if you keep those shadows dark enough and you keep the contrast between the shadows and your highlights stark enough, it reads as black. So you'll see here, I'm doing the same thing I did as on the face, is I'm kind of blocking out those highlights. I'm not being super precise here. I'm kind of just finding that raised edge and adding this lighter gray, and then I'll go back in later and I'll glaze it with the darker color and kind of pull colors together that way. So it's not about being perfect here. So here I'm coming in with another gray. This one's a little lighter, so you don't have to do this necessarily. I could have mixed some white into other gray, but I have other gray paints and it's a little simpler doing it this way. So I just find another color, in this case, another lighter gray from the Two Thin Coats range, and I use that. So same deal as on the face, I kind of go even more towards the edge. Like I focus this one only on the edge and only on those high raised areas. And then I go in with this brown and I mix the gray to kind of add those midtones because I want him to look dirty. His clothes in the movie look pretty dirty and like this dark brown, gray, black color. So you can see I'm kind of adding that in as a shadow, and that's going to start creating that contrast between the really light highlights I'm doing here and the black armor underneath. So here you can see I'm going in with that black color, really watered down, and it's just kind of in the cracks and crevices where it's going to be light wouldn't be showing. So you might think this is counterintuitive, like I'm highlighting this stuff and then I'm going back in with the black, and it's kind of finding like the same deal with the skin tone, finding that happy medium where I go back and forth between the dark color and the light color to kind of find that happy balance. You can see here I'm going really light with the white here, the ivory, and that's just on the very edge. So that's where that light would be catching off of pretty much directly. So I try to do just on the edges or like just on the highest raised area to add that contrast. And there you can see there's a little blending done off camera, but you kind of get that color. All right, so time to start on his weapons and outer accessories. I think the tunic's done. So what I'm doing here is his shield is like this dark black kind of like gray color, and his sword's the same kind of metallic gray color. So I'm coming in and like it's metallic, but it's not super shiny metallic. So I do still want to have some highlights and make it look more gray to sell that it's got light shining off of it, but I don't want it to be super highlighted. So I'm not going to do any white in here. And if I do, there's going to be very little bit. So mostly a light gray here, and then I'll come back in with the black to make sure it's all blended together. So here with the sword, I wanted to try to do a non-metallic metal kind of sheen just on this blade edge. So my idea here is a little bit of storytelling, is like he's going to keep his sword nice and sharp, even though maybe it's not fully like taken care of. Maybe the back of the sword is getting rusty, or you know, it's this crudely made Uruk weapon made by the orcs over in Isengard. So it's probably not going to be super well kept. Kind of do this non-metallic metal shine just on that blade edge, and you can see I kind of struggle with it a little bit, and then I bring it all back together with that black edge line and kind of pull it back down because it gets a little wide, I think. The trick with non-metallic metal is definitely blending those colors together. That's the hardest part for me, is making sure I get that nice smooth blend from the super bright highlight into the dark recesses, and those contrasts on metal happen really quickly. So that's the hard part, is kind of making it look right that way. So you'll see I go back and forth here with the black and the gray to try to blend that all together. All right, so here you see me going into the bow. I take some of that beige brown and kind of just give this quick base coat. The bow really doesn't have any detail on this pewter model. I think in the movie the bow's pretty generic too. It doesn't have a whole lot of detail to it. It's got those like blades at the actual handle. I don't know what that's called. Sorry. So I paint those like metal blades, but the rest of the bow is just this generic brown, and then I add a little bit of a lighter brown as a highlight. Next thing you see me paint here is the shield. So he's got his shield up in like this kind of weird angle. So I want to give it this metallic shine. So I kind of do the same thing. I go off from the very tippy top of the shield, kind of at like a little bit down from there to start that highlight, because the metal is probably not going to be, it just makes it look the best that I've noticed. And you can see on the bottom of the shield there, I add a little bit of a highlight too. So with metal in real life, there's light bouncing off of everything, and the metal catches that. So just because his shield is going to be a little bit duller and kind of more of this matte finish gunmetal gray thing, because it's shiny metal, I kind of give it a bounce light, and that bounce light I kind of just made brown coming from the ground, so nothing too crazy. You'll see a lot of people doing this with an airbrush. I have not had a whole lot of practice with an airbrush. I know it's a great tool, and I know it's really helpful for painting, but I have not gone into that before. So most of my work is with a paintbrush. Sometimes I'll use a sponge to kind of bring that together. Then here you can see I'm starting to blend that highlight in. So that, again, my process is chunky highlights and then blend them in and kind of feather them in. So really tiny little strokes here with paint, feathering that middle tone into that shadow tone into that highlight. And that's kind of what gives you that nice, smooth, metallic look. Is it perfect? Probably not, but that's okay. It looks good. I think for tabletop play, this model is going to be really cool. And one thing with the blending and the feathering is like, it's not going to look good at first, but you got to trust your ability ability and trust your process, because once you get to a point where you have blended it all together, it looks fine. Don't stress if it doesn't look good at first. And this is me coming back in with that really bright color. I think this is the ivory tusk that I'm using here, and that's kind of like the cherry on top. Once you add that final highlight, that's when that metal kind of shows. And here I'm going over his hair. Lurtz has black hair, so again, to make it sell black, you kind of just give it a little bit of a gray highlight. I don't go anything crazier than that mid-tone gray that I was using on everything else here. His hair is not really a centerpiece, it's kind of the back of the model. And I just use the side of my brush there to kind of lightly highlight the hair strands. These metal models, computer doesn't pick up the hair texture very well, so you do what you can. You can only do so much with these metal models, especially with the finer, smaller details like that. And then here I'm going back into some of those darker metal parts and bringing in that black color again with a glaze. And then I do the back of the sword here. I'm getting pretty close to being done. I'm just coming back in and touching up spots I don't like. Sometimes it's good to take a little break from parts of the model and move on to something else and then come back with fresher eyes, just because then you'll like kind of be able to see it bigger picture and also be able to see what you were doing wrong before, because sometimes if you just stick on this one part of the model, you get stuck into just like going over and over it again. And here I'm painting his shin guards. Again, they're like this gray black matte metal, and obviously the light wouldn't be hitting them too much from down below with the angle they're at, so I make sure that highlight's really bright up on the tip there, and then kind of towards the bottom of the shins they're a little darker. Here I come in with that highlight on the bow. This is just a brighter brown with, I believe, some of that tan mixed in, and it's just to give it a little bit of shine. It's not supposed to be the centerpiece, so I don't want to go crazy with it. One thing with the sword that I like to do to kind of show that it's metal, especially if you're doing non-metallic metal, which I'm trying to do here, that really bright highlight up on the edges is really helpful. So maybe the highlight doesn't touch that edge, but if that edge is highlighted with a really bright color, it sells more as metal. Here I come in on the back of the tunic, and you can see I'm blocking in those highlights again. So the tunic already has a couple glaze coats over it with brown and gray, and then I'm coming in with that brighter gray and then glazing them together to make it all mesh. Here I'm doing the quiver for the bow. So the way I do leather typically is I'll do a dark brown to start. I'll go back in with some really bright highlights with the tan or really bright brown and kind of give it some scratches and do some edges here, so you can see I'm doing some like scratchy textures, make it look like it's worn in a little bit and like the light's catching some of the wrinkles maybe. And then you go back in with that darker brown and you glaze it over, and it brings everything together and it looks really good. Here I'm just starting to finish up the model. I'm painting his arrows coming out of that quiver and the back of his bow here. So you'll see I go in here with that Skeleton Legion from Tooth and Coat. So this is just like a beige khaki color, and I'm just kind of going over it. I like to leave some of that black primer to show through there to keep it in the shadows. Then I go over with an even brighter color, a brighter like ivory color over just the very tips and the edges to kind of catch those feathers and make them look like they're coming in from a nice like dark color. And then I'm just going to finish up the back of the sword. Some more of that non-metallic metal thing going on here. I don't think I spend quite as much time on the back of the model. I mean, you're looking at his face, right? You don't need to see the back too much. Same deal, I do the blade edge, this non-metallic metal, and then I try to make the middle of the sword like this dark gray matte black color. And there we go. That's Lurtz. So there's my model painted. Still need to do the base though. Sometimes I do the base before, sometimes I'll do it after. The only reason to do it before is so you don't have to worry about getting the model dirty, and the only reason to do it after is because you're lazy, and that's not the fun part to paint. Even though the base brings it all together and kind of adds that creative artwork piece to it, I would just say be careful when you're doing this. Obviously you don't want to get any paint from the base onto your actual model, especially if you're done with it. So you'll see here I'm painting that little resin rock. I'm just doing a gray with a dry brush, lighter gray over it, and then you kind of go back into the shadows with that darker gray, and then with a little grass tuft next to it, I just do a little bit of that yellow green from Acryl, and then kind of highlight that up to a bright yellow. Then I take some more of that bright yellow green color and I use my dry brush. You could use a wider, like a bigger brush too for this, but I like to dry brush over because this basing that I use has a lot of the static grass kind of just sticking out, so I wanted to catch a lot of those raised areas and keep the bottom kind of dark, like he's running through a wet field maybe where the dirt underneath the grass is still muddy. So you'll see I kind of come in, I just keep blending these colors together using a dry brush. So I'm alternating between like the brown and the green and a little bit of that bright color to make it feel more natural. You know, looking grass outside, it's not all just this uniform color, dead grass too. So then after I'm kind of happy with that, I go back in with the small brush and touch up some of the details that I dry brushed over. Then I'm going back in here with some brown, just kind of randomly to make it not feel so uniform. Don't want any colors to be too prevalent here on the base. And then to finish it all off, I do a couple of tufts, just, you know, use some white glue and glue them on there. And then there you go. That's the model pretty much completed. I think he came out pretty well. He's definitely tabletop ready. I don't know if I'd ever be able to enter this guy into a painting competition, but I think it looks pretty good.